Welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Trigger words put forth by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Here, find us on tertiumquids.org. These days, you never know what a trigger word is anymore, but freedom and prosperity, probably run together like that, is certainly something that's going to send some school administrator looking for the rule book and to send your kids home. Our first guest this week, as we talk about some of the things that may not be front of brain, but it impacts you every single day. As much as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bill Nye, the science guy, like to show off how little they know about science, certainly that's low-hanging fruit. But odds are you get a delivery from the U.S. Postal Service every day. If you order from Amazon, perhaps even on a Sunday afternoon. So why is this organization on such a thin edge? Why is it on such thin ice? And join us to get into this a little bit this week. Ross Marchand joins us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio from the Taxpayers Protection Alliance, and certainly we're going to go down with the Postal Service if that happens. Ross, thank you for taking some time out with us this week. How are you doing, sir?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Not at all. So what is it about the Postal Service? I was reading your piece on the Postal Report, reform, congressional reform. But first and foremost, let's get into what substantively is wrong with something that goes all the way back to the founding of the U.S. Constitution, the establishment. I mentioned Bill Nye in the opening. He misrepresented Article 1, Section 8, but in it says the establishment of post offices and post roads. How has the Postal Service lost its way?
Right, and it's tragic to see because it's a once proud, once great organization. It's really fallen by the wayside. It's bleeding cash year in, year out over the decade, having lost tens of billions of dollars. But I think most importantly, there's trust lost between carriers and individuals receiving packages, mail.
Well, and certainly we've seen here in our flagship city issues with the postmasters, overworking. People are told at 4 o'clock in the afternoon to stop delivering regular mail to get the Amazon packages delivered, and you wonder, well, if you've got that many Amazon packages, why can't we dedicate some people to it? So where's all the money going?
Well, the money is going towards a lot of sort of waste and just areas where there are easy opportunities for reform, but yet these opportunities have just not been realized. And that's why TTA wrote their postal report. And we identified more than $3.3 billion worth of savings. And that's not even something that Congress has to fix. That's something that postal leadership has to fix. So just one example is that the USPS is overpaying their contractors for work that the contractors are not even doing.
Gosh.
And if they could just fix that, I mean, that right there alone is hundreds of millions of dollars a year.
Wow. That goes a long way towards getting more carriers on the street. Now, what are these contractors doing for the Postal Service?
So they're doing something called middle mile. So that's basically they're taking mail and they're taking packages from postal facilities, these huge sorting centers throughout the country, and they're bringing them to post offices.
Okay.
That's kind of like the middle leg of the journey, way before mail and packages actually reach your front door.
So it's these trucks that are pulling in behind the post office that are dropping off packages that they say they picked up near the airport. These are not Postal Service trucks. These are contractors.
Exactly. A lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of it has been contracted out. And unfortunately, some of these contractors, they are billing the Postal Service for work services not rendered. Or, at the very least, maybe they're late for a delivery. Well, there's a formula for kind of eliminating or whittling down that pay, but they're charging for the full fee. And that makes absolutely no sense. And the Inspector General looked at that issue and said, this is something where the Postal Service is losing hundreds of millions of dollars a year.
Now, I've heard stories over the years about their union agreements and their human resources department. Because they're a government agency, they're required to have all pension monies on hand at any given moment. Should everybody retire at once? And I'm not even sure how much of this could actually be feasible. But does this need to be looked at as the work agreements between the letter carriers and the Postal Service?
Sure, all of that needs to be looked at, and no doubt sort of labor and pension and all sorts of retirement funding is a major cost contributor to USPS's problems. But what I would say is that pre-funding, and that's what that's called, having all that money on hand at once for retirement, let's say like 50 or 75 years in the future, that is something where, to a large extent, if companies just on the open market don't have arrangements for retirement for their employees, that's going to be reflecting their stock prices, and it's going to look bad for them as a company when investors are looking at who to invest in. Postal Service can't go out of business. They don't face that problem.
I see what you're saying with that. Now, your report, Ross, talks about their pricing programs, and it has long been held that as big and expansive as the U.S. Postal Service is, and as much as we love to complain about the mail, it's relatively inexpensive on the global scale for just sending a letter to somebody. Is that what you're talking about with that?
It's relatively inexpensive, but the problem is just the pricing overall, and how different kind of segments and mail and package pricing relate to each other. The problem is the Postal Service is using money from first-class mail, it's just regular letters, to subsidize, to underwrite package deliveries. And that subsidy is something like $1.50 for each and every package. And when the pricing system is out of whack, that means the finances are going to be out of whack. And I think that's a major reason why you see such large losses from the Postal Service.
So they're undercutting the package prices. And in this day and age of FedEx and UPS and the other carriers, why can't the U.S. is the only thing the U.S. Postal Service got is a lower price for package deliveries?
Yeah, they're trying to undercut their competition via lower prices, but unlike their competitors, they can't go out of business. It's kind of an unfair foray into the competitive products, things like packages. I think the most unfair part of this is that they're using money from things they have control over, things they have a monopoly over, which is just regular letters. So if they raise the price of a regular letter from 50 cents to 55 cents, customers have no alternatives because of that legal monopoly that the Postal Service has on mail.
And part of it and parcel, we've seen this in several of the cases revolving around Trump associates and campaign. Mail fraud is still one of the highest crimes that somebody can get caught with, is sending something through the U.S. Postal Service. Number one, you have a legal stamp on it, bordering on a notary stamp is the postmark. And then if you mail something knowingly fraudulent through the mail, you're going away for a long time. So, I mean, there are legal components of having a U.S. Postal Service that I don't think people realize happen or attach themselves to it, Ross.
Oh, absolutely. And listen to this. This is really wacky, and I uncovered this a few months ago when I was doing some research into the Postal Service. If, let's say, the Postal Service messes up your delivery in any way, or they damage something very valuable that is intended to get to you, they can't be sued for it. Now, let's say UPS or FedEx does the same thing. They could be sued for that. But negligent sort of transmission of mail or damage or anything like that, the federal government makes sure that USPS will not be held accountable. And I think that is a big reason why you hear all these USPS horror stories.
Now, the Constitution, Ross, and we're visiting, and this is going to be heresy, and anyone who listens to this program at any given point in time knows that I tend to throw the really bizarre stuff out, and then 5 or 6 years later it comes back because it's become an orthodox thought. But I'm going to ask this, because the Constitution only mandates the establishment of post offices and post roads. That a lot of the other stuff has just kind of mission creeped its way into the U.S. Postal Service. I've argued that there's no constitutional mandate that they walk it up to my door and put it into a box on my building or anything of that nature even. Could some of the reforms be, even privatizing some of that stuff, saying, all right, we've got the office here. If you all want private delivery, go ahead and get it, in your communities or locally, but we're not doing that anymore. What would the blowback be on something like that?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Now, I believe that the constitutional text says can, not must, as in Congress has that ability to establish post roads and postal services, but that's not a requirement. But as to something like privatization, issue with that is that whenever people talk about it legislatively, it's always dead on arrival. Mm-hmm. So I think that talking, at least right away, about privatization is a mistake. And the better way to look at it is the Postal Service is a valuable service and has a proud history, has a great history, but how can we bring it back to that? How can we make the Postal Service great again?
So let's talk about some of the easier reforms and talk about some of the legislative issues that might befall them, Ross. And just for background, we're visiting with Ross Marchand from the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. And I want to get into the high-risk classification that they got from Homeland Security. But first, let's talk about the legislative realities of reforming the U.S. Postal Service. I can't see a lot of people out there running out and saying, I've got a plan. I don't think it's a sexy presidential campaign platform for any of the Democrats. And when the president tried it and brought it up, it was a rebuke of almost bipartisan stun.
Absolutely. And you look at some of these legislative proposals or just the proposals that were talked about in the task force report, which was released a few months ago. And this week there's a Senate hearing on that task force report. And listen, different things kind of stuck out to different people reading the report. But one thing that really stuck out to me was you could take the mailbox, and right now there's a monopoly on the mailbox, so only USPS could put stuff in your mailbox. But you could change that, and the Postal Service could sell access to your mailbox, and this way they can make a lot of money, and you could have packages, you could have small, medium-sized packages go directly into your mailbox. So I think it's just kind of a win-win situation, and that's something that Congress could certainly consider.
Does that put, again, we go back into the legal ramifications of a postmark and that kind of thing. Does that take that chain of evidence thing, and open up, where legally somebody could say, hey, I don't know who put that in my mailbox, third parties, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, and I'm sorry, I know too many lawmakers and too many lawyers. I feel like I need to go find a beach somewhere for 2 years. But I worry about that chain of evidence kind of thing.
But I think that the issue of fraud with USPS and mail transmission, I think that goes even deeper than that, and that needs to be sort of a dedicated issue that Congress addresses and postal leadership addresses. And it's not only mail fraud, it's also opioids. I mean, just illicit kind of sending of drugs. And that is a huge issue, and President Trump has repeatedly brought that up. Mm-hmm. And I think that USPS needs to make greater use of scanning technology and sort of be more efficient about that detection process. So I think that needs to be addressed as a separate issue entirely.
So, Ross, let's talk about Homeland Security and their categorization of the U.S. Postal Service as high risk. Talk about the committee that oversees them, USPS high risk. This is from the from the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. What does this mean?
Right. Because the Postal Service is so important, like what you pointed out before, a lot of it does fall under that purview of Homeland Security because you could, remember 2002, people were supposedly mailing anthrax through the mail.
Right.
And I think that probably established it, if more than anything else, under the purview of Homeland Security. So I think it just kind of underscores the fact that everyone has an interest in making sure that we have efficient and secure and safe mail transmission.
Is this something where, again, as we did in World War II, some presidential leadership saying, hey, we need to start expecting a little less so that we can secure a little more through the Postal Service? And put that as a macro. Are we expecting a lot for too little? It seems like it in some of your pricing proposals, Ross.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, if you do reform right, you don't need to kind of lower your expectations. Because, for example, you have thousands of post offices across the country that are basically seeing no business, and they're not out in the middle of nowhere. They're right next to more successful post offices. So that's one good example. If you close those thousands of post offices that are not working for the American people, then you could even raise your expectations while saving millions of dollars a year.
I hadn't even thought about that. What about things like sorting facilities? We had one here in our flagship city of Charlottesville for many years, and they closed it and then moved all of it to the Richmond facility, which seemed, to be efficient. And then a private company was able to buy the facility and start doing medical equipment manufacturing on the footprint. Are some of these postal service facilities in the way of private enterprise doing things there? And talk about, even as an abstract, what kind of private-public partnerships could save the post office?
Absolutely, and you're seeing that throughout the country. I mean, so many just sort of missed opportunities. And you go into a post office. I mean, I don't know about you. When I walk into my post office, I see so much space that could be put to better use. And, just kind of like these huge empty atriums. And you look at the Bronx post office, for example, and they recently, I think they revitalized it. They put up a food court there. And when you work with the private sector like that, you could make smarter sort of real estate decisions around these postal properties. And yeah, again, you could save hundreds of millions of dollars a year.
So, Ross, one of the things that stuck out of your report to me, and I wanted to save this for the end because this is the one that's most stunning and that any business owner goes through. I've run restaurants, radio stations, making sure there's, the people where they need to be. The Postal Service, as far as I understand your report, has created a program, computer software, to help their postmasters put the people in the right places at the right time. Yet, according to your report, to the tune of $420 million annually is lost because they don't use it? Really?
Absolutely. They don't consistently use it. And this is something that's simple. And
they don't even have to invent it. They already have.
And it's as simple as matching your employees to the places where your employees are needed the most. And a lot of companies have, trial and error, just years and years and years, and they've gotten it, it's never going to be perfect, but it's going to be reasonable. And if they could do something as simple as matching it and making sure that scheduling tool is consistently applied, they could save $420 million a year. So why not do it?
That's amazing. And explain what highway contract rate is in your report, because there's $1 billion that they could save if they did this better, Ross?
Sure. That goes back to what I was discussing earlier with that middle mile. And you have contractors, and they're being overpaid for services they did not provide.
How do they get away with that? I mean, who's doing oversight on what's happening, or is it...
Who's doing oversight? That is a great question. That's $1 million question. Well, you have
$1 billion question.
Yeah, the $1 billion question. You have the Inspector General, and they issue reports from time to time saying this is not right. This is costing way too much money. But the problem is, if the Postal Service doesn't listen to the Inspector General, what's really getting done? Absolutely nothing.
So the report goes into a desk drawer, and it's like, all right, we got the report. Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Right, exactly.
Thanks for playing. Have a nice day.
Right, exactly. Yeah, have a nice day. We'll look at it in 2 years.
But I mean, are people so safe in their jobs that they just ignore these kind of things, or do they? Are they just sure that as long as it looks like a dysfunctional system, nobody's ever going to want to roll up their sleeves and try to do anything about it?
Absolutely. There's no real motivation for reform. People are safe from any sort of discipline or being fired or anything like that. There's no competition. There's no incentive for innovation. So I think that if nothing else, we need to make sure that we hold leadership's feet to the fire and make sure we have these reforms to erase all that red ink and make sure that we have trust restored between carriers and customers.
So let me ask you a question. I know that the president made some hay about Jeff Bezos. And I guess it's, kind of a little, personality battle between the two of them. But considering the U.S. Postal Service's relationship with Amazon, and I presume it's a fairly lucrative contract, the president doesn't seem to think that Amazon is paying enough. But could Amazon actually be the fulcrum to bring some of these reforms if they turn around and say, hey, you guys got to get your act together or we're pulling out of this contract?
Well, I mean, I have to think that Amazon likes, for example, the idea that for a fee, they could deliver packages into mailboxes across the country. So in that way, that's just one example where Amazon could work with the Postal Service to achieve some reforms. In terms of pricing, I mean, this is not just Amazon. This is everyone. This is any sort of major e-commerce business. They have really, really low package costs. And like I told you before, that is being subsidized. It's being underwritten by all the high and increasing letter mail costs. So I think that has to end in order for there to be real reform.
Well, what would happen if the U.S. Postal Service said to Amazon, you know what? We really can't deal with your business at this rate. This is what it costs us to do what you need us to do. You need to pay us more for it or not. Good luck with DHL and just leave it at that. I mean, it seems like U.S. Postal Service would have a pretty good bargaining position. It's been a long time since I read Art of the Deal, but I got to think.
They do have a good bargaining position. I think the question you have to ask is, are the prices kind of at a point where if they were any higher than Amazon would walk? I'm not sure if that's the case. I mean, that's kind of above my pay grade to answer. But what I will say is that Amazon and other major e-commerce players in that industry, they're building out their own networks for delivery, for kind of like end-to-end delivery. And they're their own kind of systems anyway. Mm-hmm. So I think that whether or not we keep prices the same, we lower prices, or we raise them, the same thing is going to wind up happening anyway. And I think that's a good argument for raising prices.
So at the end of the day, Ross, the Postal Service reform, how much taxpayer money is going in to kind of fill the gaps in all this money waste, aside from what we're paying for our letter deliveries and our Amazon packages?
Well, if you ask the Postal Service, they'll say zero taxpayer dollars. They love harping on that, but it's not true. And our report estimates there's more than $3.6 billion in taxpayer subsidies that are flowing to the Postal Service each and every year.
Wow. And of course they come up with whatever legalese says. No, that's actually zero. It's $3.2 billion equals zero. Only in government speak. Ross, thank you so much for everything you do. And codifying it. We'll put the links up to your report. It's protectingtaxpayers.org is the website. And best of luck. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thanks for having me on.
And a quick reminder that this program is delivered to you free of charge via broadcast airwaves. So support all the radio stations that carry Freedom and Prosperity Radio. When we come back, health care. The great Sally Pipes from the Pacific Research Institute is next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. I thought healthcare was fixed. Welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Many years ago, as a matter of fact, 10 of those many years ago, our founder, John Taylor, helped me kick off the very first Jefferson area Tea Party rally on April 15th, 2009. Shortly thereafter, the amazing Sally Pipes from the Pacific Research Institute came out and was the keynote speaker at a roundtable discussion on the burgeoning Obamacare discussion, and she's back on the phone with us. Gosh, Sally, 10 years ago, it doesn't seem like a blink of an eye. I'm glad we were able to fix all that about Obamacare when the Republicans won the House and the Senate and then the presidency, right, Sally?
Well, certainly. I mean, time flies, doesn't it? But we were pretty sure, on in January 2017 after the inauguration. I mean, what Mr. Trump and the members of Congress had promised in their campaign, that they would repeal and replace disastrous Obamacare. But here we are. It's March of 2019, and of course in 2017 they were unable to repeal and replace Obamacare. And now, if you just look at the mainstream media, we're on a path towards single payer Medicare for all, meaning single payer meaning no private coverage. And it really I've been worried about this since I left Canada in 1991, and here we are.
Yeah, and you warned us. Remember, we were crazies. We were down in the basement wearing aluminum foil hats. Oh, that would never happen. Us selling a single payer. Oh, we'll listen to you, conspiracy theorists, talking about crashing the private healthcare insurance market and forcing us into single payer. What crazies you all are, and yet here we are, and it's exactly as you laid it out, Sally. Do you have any lottery numbers you can give me? Because it seems like you're pretty good at this.
If only, I think I need to win, a couple of big lotteries so that I can go and hide on some desert island to get away from all of this mess. Yes.
Well, we're here in Virginia, of course, we have Republicans. I mean, it's not even that the Republicans have failed in repeal and replace, but we have Republicans like Emmett Hanger, a state senator here in Virginia, leading the charge to Medicaid for all and Medicaid expansions under the banner of let's get some of our money back, which it isn't the case. We've talked about this time and time again. There's been research put out by the Pacific Research Institute that that's not what's happening when they do the Medicaid expansion. And since this has happened, everyone's results here in Virginia have gotten worse. The taxes have gone up. The cost has ballooned out of control, and people are getting lousy medical service. So I don't know who it's helping, Sally.
No, it's not. And, we talked about this. We've talked about this many times over the years. I always felt that President Obama, with the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, his goal was single-payer Medicare for all. So we're seeing this, the Senate, Bernie Sanders, when he ran against Hillary Clinton in 2016 for the nomination, he really brought single-payer to the fore. And then, of course, he didn't win that. But then in 2017, he introduced a single-payer bill, S-1804. He had 16 co-sponsors, including 4 of the people who are now running in 2020 for the nomination. Mm-hmm. We've seen all of this at the state level, either single-payer or Medicaid expansion, as you say. And the Medicaid expansion, one of the things that President Obama had said, one of his rationales for Obamacare was that everybody needed to be covered, and we needed to reduce the cost of health care, and we also needed to reduce the expensive use of emergency rooms. So the Medicaid expansion was supposed to take care of these people using the emergency rooms, and of course, there's more. The emergency room use in all the states that expanded their Medicaid programs is up because these people, while they have Medicaid or in California Medi-Cal, they can't find doctors because the reimbursement rates are about 40% below what doctors get paid for treating private patients. So either they won't take patients or the waiting list is so long. So this has been, a disaster. The costs are out of control. And, some of the states are trying to implement, work requirements for people who, are able to work to reduce the cost. But the backlash by the liberals about, my goodness, making people that can work. I mean, this is just what a travesty.
Yeah, I know. They don't know who their electoral butter is on. But Sally, I was reading a piece you wrote for InsideSources.com, got picked up in some of the print media as well across the country regarding the governor's move towards the single payer and the Medicaid for all model there. And you reiterate something that comes up frequently regarding Canadians. You grew up in Canada, and it's the fool's errand that I think Americans are told that, oh, yeah, all your Toronto cousins, they all have health insurance. And it's the same thing that's the bait and switch verbally that's been going on since the beginning of this. We conflate health insurance for health care. How is it we continue to lose this linguistic battle?
Well, it really, healthcare is a complicated thing. I like to say understanding healthcare is similar to unraveling an onion, many layers and many tearful moments. Mm-hmm. I mean, Joe, a lot of people, politicians, whether in Congress or at the state level, they really don't want to deal with healthcare because it is very complicated. But I think, now with Bernie Sanders saying, I got single payer rolling. This used to be a fringe issue, pie in the sky. And he says now it's in the mainstream. And it certainly is, with his work. He's just added long-term care to his free health care. And then we have, Pramila Jayapal up in Washington State, who introduced a single-payer bill for in the House on February 27th, even more comprehensive than Bernie's bill. They never say how much it'll cost, how it will be paid for. And then all of these governors, are getting on board with, either single payer. Wisconsin governor just announced yesterday single payer, a plan that would cost $30 billion. California had a plan, $400 billion, more than double the state budget. In Washington State, a public option for everybody, which is a stepping stone to single payer. Then in Colorado, the new governor, Jared Polis, he wants to have all the western states band together with a public option, another stepping stone. So really, people need to know that in a country like Canada, which has a true single-payer system, which, as you mentioned, I grew up under, the average wait from seeing a primary care doctor to treatment by a specialist is 19.8 weeks. That's almost 5 months. Back in 1993, it was 9.3 weeks. So, and the average, it's not free. The average Canadian family pays hidden taxes of $13,000 a year for a healthcare system where you have to wait a long time, care is rationed, and there's a shortage of doctors. 63,000 Canadians out of a population of about 34 million cross the border, Joe, into the United States and pay out of pocket for procedures like MRIs, CT scans, heart stents, hip replacements, when they think the wait is too long. And so the American people need to know when government is fully in charge, there's only so much of the demand will be much greater than the supply, and therefore we would have the same problems. And I think, Americans are impatient. They're used to having the best. And when you think that 170 million Americans have employer-sponsored coverage, and 71% of them like their coverage, most of these people don't even understand that if we got Bernie's plan or Jayapal's plan or your state got a plan like this, there would be no private employer-sponsored coverage. That would all be wiped out.
Well, and why would it? The idea of competing with the government, and for the listener, think about what your enterprise is, unless you are already a government employee. And then, bear with me for a second, or flip the script. Imagine that you are somebody who tried to do what it is your government agency that you work for does. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, Sally, you're a pizzeria. And the government comes in and says, we have government-sponsored Domino's Pizza, and we're going to sell it for $5 for a 12-slice pie and deliver it for free. And you're sitting there saying, well, I can't compete with that. That's where these insurance companies. So unless we go the Venezuelan model of forced price controls and conscription into industry, what would we expect to happen if the government got involved like this?
Well, this is the frightening thing, and President Trump in his State of the Union a few weeks ago looked right at Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the House member from New York, who is very Democratic Socialists of America member, very, very liberal, and said America is not a socialist country, and it's not. But we're seeing this movement, Joe, particularly among the millennials, and a lot of people buying in, because when you say something is free, that sounds like a great idea. Free college, free health care, free all of this. But government only has so much money, and it's not their money, it's our money. We pay for these programs through the tax bill. And this, to provide, a health care plan such as Bernie's plan at $32 trillion over 10 years, that's $3.2 trillion a year, which is exactly what we spend on health care today. We're talking about doubling it, and the fact that we would also have a doctor shortage, higher and new taxes. All of these things would happen. And, the American people need to understand what this means for them. And as I say, the people with employer-sponsored coverage like it, but they think that 55% of the people with it say, oh, well, we'll keep our coverage when single payer comes in. No, they won't. All insurance companies are wiped out, as is what happened in Canada when the government took over the system.
Sally Pipes is on with us from the Pacific Research Institute. And Sally, this show is constructed with an intent. I know that shocks some people sometimes, but as the Smith Senior Smith Fellow in Healthcare Policy at the Pacific Research Institute, I want you to know the first half of this program was spent dissecting the problems with the U.S. Postal Service and the problems it's finding itself in right now. This was with the intent as to put the juxtaposition of where we are at this end of the government-run economy of the postal system to what I truly believe is the future if we go down this road with medical care, which is a medical care industry that works pretty much like the postal system. Maybe good people in there trying to do their best, but just in a system that doesn't work and leaves the people who really do want to do the right work without the resources to do it anyway.
Well, exactly. And, one of the things about the post office now, when people want to get something to a destination on time and make sure that it gets there, they can actually use the private sector in UPS, FedEx, DHL. What we're talking about here in healthcare is not allowing any of this competition. Look at the DMV. There is an example of the people are totally frustrated with the DMV, and that's about getting your driver's license. It's not about your health, which is so important to you.
Yeah, you go in, you fill out the form. Once the form finally makes it through the bureaucratic bowel movement, it comes out, and then you're done. And you talked about a 5-month period for healthcare waiting, Sally. Just on a pure humanitarian level, most health issues in 5 weeks go from treatable to critical because of the nature of the human anatomy, right?
Right, exactly. And so, if you have a terrible headache and you live in Canada and you're told that you will have to wait probably 6 months to get an MRI and you think you have a brain tumor, maybe, Joe, you may think, well, that's fine if I'm worrying and I have to wait. But if it's me and I have, this headache and I think I might have a brain tumor, you can't afford to wait 6 months because the chance that, this would actually, be operable by the time you get your MRI and then get your appointment with the neurosurgeon and then get your surgery, if you ration care like this, it does reduce the cost of health care. But that is not the American way.
What do we do to make this case better? Because as I mentioned at the onset, we've been here for 10 years, Sally, and it seems like fewer people get it now. I hear the ridiculous phrases like, we're a wealthy nation. Bernie Sanders, we're a wealthy nation. No, we're a free nation with some process. As a matter of fact, even the poorest of us are globally considered prosperous. The country doesn't have this stuff. The government doesn't have this stuff. Is this a bigger game than just collapsing the medical care system? And is this the final point of people who have grown frustrated with the restrictions of the U.S. Constitution on the pandering populism of a pure democracy, and they just want to start being able to deliver on the goods that they want to promise their electorate when they get there? And I'm sorry if I get fanciful, but I mean, when Rome collapsed, Caesar kept the Senate in session just so that the population thought things were still the same. So I think that anything had changed. I worry that maybe it's even bigger than just collapsing the healthcare system.
Well, I think you're right. I do think it is bigger. I mean, when you see Bernie Sanders, healthcare is his big issue of having a government takeover, but he talks about free college. Healthcare is a right.
College tuition's a right. Yeah.
All of these things, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being young and saying, well, all we need to do is, have the top tax rate be 70% because the rich should be paying. We need a wealth tax. What about the whole Green New Deal on energy? I mean, even Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker from San Francisco, who has always been, in my mind, very, very liberal, very progressive. She came out yesterday and said, we cannot afford Medicare for all, and we can't afford the Green New Deal. I mean, this is frightening to me when someone like Nancy Pelosi actually sounds,
like
much more moderate. This is a movement, though, in the U.S. among the very socialist people or communists like Bernie Sanders. They want government to run every aspect of our life. They don't want the private sector. The American people need to know if government is totally in charge. Look at what happened in Venezuela. Look at Cuba.
Yeah.
Are those examples of what the American people would like and how they would like to live their lives?
Well, I brought up Venezuela earlier because Venezuela was first. It was wage increases, mandatory wage increases, and then when the obligatory prices all went up, the population stormed Hugo Chavez and said, "You gave us more money, but now everything costs more." So he enacted price controls, and then the economy collapsed. It's predictable, yet we don't seem to be catching on to this. Maybe we are. Maybe if some of the politicians, the Democratic class that always played in the sandbox because it was a cool counterpoint to the conservatives, are starting to see what real communists look like, what real reparational socialists look like. Maybe this is scaring a few of them out of the reservation. Do you think that they would quit, or do you think that this is, as somebody said 2 or 3 years ago, the beginnings of a period where maybe a real third party between conservative Democrats and government Republicans get together, and then you have a conservative party, a centrist party, and then a wild lefty loony party that we can marginalize?
Well, I mean, it is an interesting idea, and I think a lot of people have been talking about that. Particularly, when you look at the number of people who are vying for the Democratic nomination for president, from Bernie Sanders on down. Several of the people. I mean, you've got Bernie Sanders, you have Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Kristen Gillibrand, Senator Cory Booker. I mean, most of these people are really for a government takeover of not just our healthcare system, but of our economy. Some of the other people that have declared, such as the former governor of Colorado, Hickenlooper, they're sort of talking a more moderate a program, and I think it'll be interesting to see if former Vice President Joe Biden gets into the race, because I think if he does, he's going to try and sort of push a more moderate agenda. But this whole very, very liberal progressive agenda has got tremendous buy-in by the American people because it sounds so good to have all of this stuff for free, and we have to let the American people, as I said a minute ago, government doesn't have money. We, the taxpayers, have money. Are we going to destroy the entrepreneurial spirit and class in this country, which is why America is such a prosperous country?
Well, Sally, let me ask you this then, because unlike what you and I see, which is Venezuela and Cuba and El Salvador, I think a lot of the progressive Republicans and Democrats alike look at the corporatist economy of China and say, well, what if we go to Jeff Bezos and say, let's be partners? What if we go to Bill Gates and say, let's be partners? Tim Cook, let's be partners. And instead of being hardcore communists, be this sort of corporatist, Shiist, I guess it used to be Maoist, but now Xi is bigger than Mao in China, style corporatist communism, where you do generate wealth enough to build cities and do these kind of things. Do you think this is what's at the mind of some of these folks like Bernie Sanders, or are they just faking it till they make it?
Well, I think even in countries like in China, where they're opening up their market to more capitalism, but it's basically private-public partnerships and things. I think we want to stay away from that. But Bernie Sanders and people like Senator Elizabeth Warren, they want to completely eliminate the private sector. They are anti-capitalist, and they, as I say, they think government should be the sole supplier. If we go down a path sort of like public-private partnerships, it's kind of like Medicare buy-in at age 50 into healthcare, or a public option. I think all of these things are stepping stones to, a government takeover. And I think that the American people, these things happen slowly, but before you know it, we would be in this kind of a situation. So the Republicans have to really get their act together and stand up and say, we are the party that supports limited government, personal responsibility, and stop hiding and sort of buying into, we'll just slowly go, this will just be a slow, move. And it's wrong. And they need to really get their act together and start educating the American people. I think, the electorate was very upset. And, the Democrats took the House back last November because the Republicans didn't push on repeal and replace, and they got swamped by the whole pre-existing conditions thing that the Democrats said 120 million Americans would lose. They had chronic conditions. That is completely wrong. Those people are except for 8 million, they're in the employer-sponsored market, and they can't have their premiums raised, and they can't lose their coverage. We were talking about 6 million people in the individual market. Why didn't the Republicans, say this? High-risk pools, federal funding, so states could have good high-risk pools for this small number of people. But, they don't seem to have the guts and the chutzpah to stand up and make these cases.
No, I think in a lot of ways they look at it and say, gosh, if we only had an issue like that, which I don't know how Liberty couldn't be a case like that or a campaign issue like that, but they just don't seem to want to make that case. They seem to always think somebody else will have some money. I mean, it's bad when the most robust speech regarding how taxation drives out wealth is given by Andrew Cuomo recently. It's a scary place we've gotten into. What happened to the Republicans that used to defend this stuff? Sally, what is your, in the last minute since we've been doing this, what is your feel? How much worse does it have to get before it gets better?
Well, I mean, I think it is bad right now. And the 2020 election, nothing can happen in single payer at the federal level until the 2020 election, which is in November of 2020. But, these people are laying the groundwork for this and making it so that when the election comes up, they're going to be, just hell-bent for leather on moving this down the path. So the Republicans need to get their act together, come up with a free market approach to all of these things, and really, I mean, the job, Joe, for you and for me is to educate Americans on what this means for them, whether it's their health care or their college education or their children going to medical school.
Well, we'll keep doing that. Sally Pipes, PacificResearch.org. Thank you so much for taking some time out with us again this week, and we'll keep doing this even if it's another 10 years.
Yes, exactly, Joe. Thank you.
And thank you for listening. For all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.